Right around a third of the way through the NBA season, we have a pretty good idea of where every single team is in terms of tanking or not tanking, contenders, pretenders, and we also have questions for every single team in the league, and that is what we're going to be tackling in today's video. Really quickly though, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Prize Picks. Now, if you're watching some or a lot of my videos, and you probably watch a lot of the NBA, and if you feel like on a night-to-night basis, you have a pretty good idea of how particular players might perform against certain teams, then Prize Picks is the place to be. And right now at Prize Picks, if you click the link in the description and you use code SPORTING, they will match 100% of your deposit up to $100. So if you deposit $100, you're going to get 100 extra in promo credits again when you use that code SPORTING and you click the link down in the description. Now, if you don't know what Prize Picks is, you've never done it before, or you want a little bit of a refresher, this is exactly what it is. The best way I can describe it is you against the numbers. You go online, you go on the app and you look and see what Prize Picks has set in terms of what they think may or may not happen in these games. And you pick more or less for each of these players. So you pick between 2 and 5 players, and if you get it correct, then you win some cash. So for example, you can look at combined points, assists, rebounds, just points, just assists, just rebounds, turnovers, 3-pointers made. They're always adding new stuff. And one of the other things I would take a look at if I were you is on occasion, they'll have some additional options for you. So sometimes on Fridays, they'll do a little bit of an extra, winnings for you if you get it correct. Or on occasion, they'll change some of the numbers and essentially give you a free space. For example, having someone just score one single point, and you can pick obviously more for that, and you get a free space there. That's a great opportunity to really boost your chances of winning some cash. But again, the app is Prize Picks. It's just you against the numbers. And if you feel like you have a good idea of how a particular player is going to play, especially things like rebounds or things that I like to do a lot, assists are things I like to do a lot, you can combine some stuff together, pick more or less for each of these players against each of these teams, and potentially win some cash. Again, the app is Prize Picks. The link is down in the description for a 100% deposit match up to $100. You can click the link, you can use code SPORTING, and thank you again to Prize Picks for sponsoring this video. First up is the Milwaukee Bucks. There's not a lot of questions about this team. They're very clearly top tier contenders, especially now that they're getting guys like Chris Middleton back. Once they get Middleton and Holiday and Giannis all together, they're going to be very good. Feels like maybe they're a guard short, and that's where the question's going to come from, is like, what move could they make to put themselves over the top, potentially adding a wing, adding a guard, adding someone else that can space and can guard for them. And interestingly, the question as well is like, is this maybe the last run you have with this group, considering the injury concerns with Middleton and Holiday, considering the fact that they're getting a little bit older? This might be your last opportunity with these 3 guys together. And do you really want to go all in and try and get, like I said, one more wing to add to this group? That's a big question for them. Next up now is Golden State. And there's a lot of questions actually for Golden State, surprisingly, coming off of a championship winning season. For me, I have to know what direction we're going in here. Like, is this a year that you are trying to go all in? Is this a all-in year for you? Or are you going to risk trading away some of the younger players, sacrificing a little bit of your future to capitalize on what has been an incredible Steph season? Or are you just going to continue to do what you've done for pretty much years and just wait things out, and hope that things correct themselves? It's worked out well for them in the past, but is there a move coming for Golden State? That certainly is a question for them. Next up now is the Brooklyn Nets. It's very obvious. Are they contenders? And if they're not, what moves can they make to potentially shift the future direction of this team? Do you keep Kyrie Irving on the roster? Do you look to make some kind of move there? There's been some encouraging signs since they fired Steve Nash, brought in Jacques Vaughn to be the head coach. There's been some advanced numbers that show that the Nets are contenders now under Jacques Vaughn, but obviously the concerns with Simmons' health, with the responsibility that Kevin Durant has had from a minutes perspective so far this season, lots of questions around the Nets, and the question for sure is, are they contenders, and is there an option for them to maybe make themselves a little bit more legit as a contender, or is it not even worth it and they need to explore other trades on the roster? Next up now is Dallas, and the question is this sustainable for Luka? And I'm just going to go ahead and tell you the answer. It's not. There's just no way that you can have a player have this high of a usage rate for the entirety of a season and expect, 1, for them to not break down at a certain point during the year. 2, if they do break down, you can't expect the rest of the team to be very good when you're relying on someone as much as they're relying on Luka. And 3, it's definitely not going to work in the playoffs. This is something that we've seen for years, where this style, where it's all about one guy constantly creating and doing everything for you, is just not a sustainable way to play once you get to the postseason. And even though this is a team that made the Western Conference Finals last year and very clearly has an MVP candidate on the roster in Luka, they need to find a way, whether it be through roster moves or an adjustment in terms of how they play, to take some of the responsibility off of Luka in the interest of him long term and not wearing down too much, as well as making them a more dangerous playoff team. Next up now, the LA Lakers. The question is this the time to make a move? Now, there's 2 different directions you can go in here in terms of making a move. Maybe you want to explore trading away Anthony Davis because his value's probably never been higher higher right now, assuming that he continues to stay healthy or is healthy. And if you have the opportunity to get a ton of value for him, maybe that's the move. Or you obviously have the constant threat of the Russell Westbrook trade or some other trades and moves along the perimeter. They've been playing better since a disastrous beginning of the season. And if you have the opportunity to make a move one way or the other, that's certainly the question that is going to constantly be swirling around this team leading up to the February trade deadline. Next up now for Philadelphia, it's very clear. Can they stay healthy? This is a team and a roster that I think is very well put together in terms of a possible postseason run. They have guys that can guard and can shoot. They have 3 star-level players, yes, including Tyrese Maxey in there, and they have someone in Tobias Harris that can score for you, can guard for you a little bit, is never going to meet the expectations people have for him. Maybe that's a move they can make trade-wise, but in terms strictly of their roster, they are a contending team to me. It just depends on if Embiid is going to be healthy, if Harden is going to be healthy. Tyrese Maxey's had an injury this year as well. Can they stay healthy? Can they find a way to get through the regular season with their top 9 or 10 guys fully intact, ready to go? Because if they can do that, I think they're honestly as big of a threat as any team in the Eastern Conference other than Milwaukee and other than Boston. And I think, again, if healthy, they're probably closer to those two teams than we'd expect right now, given where they are in the standings. Next up now, the Portland Trailblazers. You have to think about what's next. What's the next move for you? You've had a successful offseason. Bringing back Anthony Simons has obviously been a good idea. Bringing in Jeremy Grant has been really impactful for them. And even without Damian Lillard and due to some injury issues with him, they've still been a pretty good team this year. And a lot of the pieces that I just talked about, like I said, Simon signed the extension. Dame's going to be sticking around for a while. Nurkic is going to be sticking around for a while. Grant should be getting an extension offer in the offseason. What's the move after that? How do you continue to add to this group? Is it just being patient and waiting around for Sharp to continue to grow and develop into the wing that they need on this roster? Is it just hoping that maybe you make a nice run in the postseason and you're not necessarily trying to be a contender, you're just trying to be a perennial playoff team? Figuring out what the next move is for this group in terms of adding one more piece feels like the biggest question looming, because they're definitely a solid team, but I would not count them as a contender. And if that's not where they want to be, if they want to be at a contender status, they need to figure out what's the next move for them. Next up now for Atlanta, was this a mistake? It's a weird situation because I think the DeJounte Trae Young thing has actually worked pretty well. Like, there's a lot of situations where last year they would have been really predictable late in games, and DeJounte Murray has added an extra element for them. But some of the other moves that they made, whether it be to accommodate the upcoming extension for DeJounte Murray or just shifting around the roster, like getting rid of Kevin Huerter, still not having a solution for John Collins, Onyeka Okongwu not developing in the way that you would have hoped that they would, a little bit of redundancy between him and Clint Capella, DeAndre Hunter and him just constantly struggling to be on the floor. There's just so many moving pieces on this roster, and makes you wonder, like, have we made this massive move to trade all these picks for DeJounte Murray to ultimately pay him this big extension here coming up just to be like a 48-win team and a team that's not actually close to contending? Because there are other moves you could have made that didn't give up the same kind of value in exchange for DeJounte Murray that could have put you on like a 48-win pace, and you could have just stuck with the like Trae Young is everything that we do offensively kind of team that they had before. I'm not saying that it's necessarily a disaster. Certainly a lot of people are going to be looking at a coaching change here in terms of replacing Nate McMillan, but is this roster, is this team in general a mistake? I think is certainly a question right now around Atlanta. Moving on now to Washington, and the question is it time to blow it up? Because there's actually some really interesting and intriguing pieces on this roster, and the two that I personally would look to move right now would be either Bradley Beal and or Kristaps Porzingis. And I know that Porzingis is playing well right now, and he's still a pretty young player, but it's kind of like the Anthony Davis thing to me, where like if he's healthy and he's playing well, his value is going to be really, really high. And given the contract that he's on, given how low his value was when they traded for him last year, I would really explore trading away Kristaps Porzingis to potentially a desperate team, maybe even in the Western Conference, maybe even a team in LA that maybe would be willing to give up some assets in exchange for Kristaps Porzingis. That'd be something I would take a look at. And I'm still just not a big Bradley Beal guy on this roster. I like a good amount of the players that Washington has. I think Denny's good. I think Kyle Kuzma is really good, and especially in terms of the value he provides you on the contract that he's on. And I don't think it would be an awful idea, even given the fact that they've been a decent team this year, to explore trading away some of those bigger contracts and some of those veterans and really resetting this roster around some of the intriguing high value trade pieces that they already have on the roster, rather than just continually being, a play-in team basically with those expensive veterans like Porzingis and Beal on the roster. I'd really explore trading either of those two guys. Next up now is the Boston Celtics. And for me, it's like, how does Robert Williams fit into this group? Because they have been far and away the best team in the league to begin the season. And it's interesting the way that they've done it, because at times they've slipped a little bit defensively, but they've been the best offense in the league. Like, they're making a ton of shots. They're the highest volume three-point shooting team in the league, the highest percentage three-point shooting team in the league. They are setting a historic pace right now offensively. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that every single player that plays for them, with the exception of Blake Griffin on occasion, can shoot the basketball. And Robert Williams is going to disrupt that a little bit. And the identity that they built last year largely revolved around having Robert Williams as this roaming presence, switching everything else, having him protect the rim, and that defensive reputation that they built. And trying to integrate that back into a team that has been so successful is really the only question mark for them, because they've been unbelievable. Tatum's been an MVP caliber guy. Jaylen Brown's been an all-NBA caliber player. And it's just, how do you integrate a piece that I think they're going to need in the postseason and they missed, certainly in the postseason at times last year? How do they integrate such an important piece while maintaining the potent offense that they've had to begin this season? Next up now, Chicago. To me, this isn't even a question. This is just like blow it up, like figure it out. Like, what can we get, I guess, is the question for them. What can you get in exchange for Zach LaVine potentially, or Vucevic, or DeMar DeRozan? This is not, or Alex Caruso. This is just not a team that has a future right now. It's not a team that is even remotely close to contention. And right now, like, they're not even a play-in team. Like, that's where they're at right now in an Eastern Conference where there's a good amount of teams struggling at the bottom of the standings. Chicago is almost right there with some of these tanking teams. I know that they have a couple of decent wins and you're waiting on guys to get healthy. Guys like Lonzo, LaVine hasn't been healthy, but at a certain point, you have to look at the roster and understand this just isn't it. Like, we can try and be the 7th seed, but that doesn't do anything for you when you owe future picks, when your guys are getting older, when there's no upside, there's no ability to improve internally on the roster. It just, what can you get in exchange for those guys? There's going to be teams around the league that would love to have Zach LaVine, that would love to have Vucevic, that would love to have DeRozan, and you can get good value for those guys. They'd love to have Caruso. And I think it's time. I really think it's time for them to blow it up in Chicago. Next up now is the Miami Heat. And if it was any other team than the Heat, I would have the exact same question about them as I just did for Chicago and I did for Washington. But given the fact that, like, this is a team that we've seen for years, always find ways to figure it out. My question for them is just, can you be healthy? Because I think if they are healthy and they've got, their top 9 guys going to the postseason, and I'm including Kyle Lowry in that, I think they're as dangerous of a playoff team as almost anybody else we have in Eastern Conference. I know that's a strange thing to say given where they are in the standings and given some of their struggles this season, but there's just something about Miami that you trust if they can get to the postseason fully healthy with Oladipo, with Lowry, with Hero, Bam. And yes, they're missing someone like PJ Tucker, and yes, Jimmy Butler hasn't necessarily had, his best start to the season as a team overall. But to me, it's just, can they get healthy? And if they get healthy and they're still this bad, then you start really evaluating the roster as a whole. But right now, I think they, more than any other team in the league, it's like them and the Warriors are very much still in wait and see mode. Next up now for Toronto, I'm just going to ask the question, like, were we a little bit too high on Scotty Barnes? This has not been a fantastic Scotty Barnes season. He's been dealing with some injury issues, as has most of the Toronto roster. And just when I watch him, there's a level of confidence that was there last year that isn't there right now. And the impact level just isn't quite where I want it to be. Now, I understand that Toronto is a bit of a weird team, right? Because kind of on a night-to-night basis, it can be pretty much anybody's night offensively, and they play so aggressive defensively. They've been missing so many guys, but when you go and look at his numbers and you watch him play, like, there was supposed to be a bit more of a leap here. Like, this is a guy that they refused to put in Kevin Durant trade talks. Like, think about having Kevin Durant on this roster. They refused to put Scotty Barnes in those trade talks, and he just has not performed quite up to that level. I understand he's just a second-year player, and when he was drafted, everybody knew that it was going to take time, but I would have liked to see a little bit more development and a little bit more growth from him this season, coming off of such an impressive rookie year. So it's not really like a question like I'm freaking out, but I'm more so just wondering, like, hey, when are we going to see a little bit more of a jump from Scotty Barnes? Next up now for the Pelicans, really there's only a few questions. One of them, of course, is health. That's going to be a question for every contending team, and I think New Orleans is a contending team. The other thing for me would just be, like, can they continue to figure out a way to be efficient offensively with, like, McCollum, Ingram, and Zion all on the floor at the same time? There's still some times, even though they haven't played together a ton because of injuries throughout the years, there's still times, especially late in games, where it's a little bit weird in terms of figuring out the dynamic between those 3 guys, who's taking the shot at the end of the game, who we're running the offense through. And, like, those are things that contenders have figured out. Like in Milwaukee, like they're in Boston, there's no question who's taking the shot at the end of the game, who you're running the offense through. And that's a question that New Orleans, I think, is going to have to figure out. And it still feels very early in this process of them, becoming this semi-contending team. But really, I mean, they have so much depth. They don't need to add anybody. They don't need to make a move. And as long as they're healthy, I think really the question is figuring out that hierarchy a little bit and getting a little bit more comfortable with all 3 of those guys on the floor at the same time. And again, most of that is just because they haven't done it a ton due to injuries. Next up now is Minnesota, and the question is, how do we unlock Anthony Edwards? Anthony Edwards has not been the same kind of guy that we would have hoped that he would coming into this season, and I don't think that it's his fault. Like, bringing in someone like Rudy Gobert and playing him alongside Karl Anthony Towns when Cat was healthy completely changes the spacing on the floor, completely changes the dynamic of how you play offensively and defensively, and it's something that I think Anthony Edwards has struggled to adjust to. There hasn't been as much space for him to be able to get to the rim as there was when Cat was out there spacing the floor. But at the same time, like if I'm Minnesota, even though I made this big investment in Rudy Gobert, if Anthony Edwards isn't continually developing and being the best player he can possibly be on a year-to-year basis, nothing else matters. Like, I'm willing to sacrifice whatever I can in terms of, getting Rudy Gobert on the floor to make sure that Anthony Edwards is getting comfortable and developing. That's the guy that matters. He's the top of the hierarchy. He's the guy that, decides everything for them moving forward. They have to figure out a way to get him comfortable, even if that means less Gobert minutes, even if that means playing a little bit smaller, even if that means, playing one big at a time more often once Cat and Gobert are both healthy and playing together again. Anthony Edwards is the key. They have to figure that out. Next up now is Oklahoma City, and the question is, do they go for this? I fully believe that if you forced every single team in the league to, one, be healthy, and two, play all their guys every single game, Oklahoma City is a playoff team in the Western Conference. They just are. Like, it might be a play-in spot. Like, it's doubtful they'd be a top 6 team given how deep the conference is. But when Shea and Giddey and all those guys are out there, we're not even accounting for the fact that Chet isn't playing, and he's, the second overall pick in the draft that they just got. Shea's been unbelievable. It's been awesome to see him continue to grow and develop into this kind of guy. And the question for them is, like, is it worth it to try and push for that play-in spot to get these guys some level of playoff experience? I know that SGA has been in the postseason already. Or do we continue to try and go towards the bottom? Because if they get Wembanyama, or they get Scoot Henderson, or they get one of the other guys, in the top 5 of this classic, that's the cherry on top. That pushes them over the top. That puts them in that, like, New Orleans this year kind of category moving into next season. And they have to decide what they value more. Another young asset, another top 5 pick, which I think they can certainly tank for, or the understanding of what it takes to win at the NBA level, what it feels like to really push for something at the end of the year. Given their history, I think we all know what the answer to that question is. They're probably going to tank, but I think the season would be much more interesting if they went for it, because they're good. Like, they are a play-in caliber team in the Western Conference, in my opinion, and it would be nice to actually see them follow through on that promise for one season. Next up now for Phoenix, it's been a question for years. Like, can we go get a guard that we trust out there other than Devin Booker and other than Chris Paul? No disrespect to Campaign. He has his moments. He has, situations where you look like, hey, this guy's a pretty good NBA player, but you need someone that you can trust a little bit more. Someone that you feel like can be a facilitator, can play alongside Devin Booker when Chris Paul goes to the bench. And let's be honest, ultimately, when Chris Paul, strains his hamstring near the end of the year or in the playoffs, you need someone else out there. There are guys that would be a perfect fit that it's unlikely you'd be able to go and get someone, like Monty Morris or something like that. Like, these teams that have these real legit backup point guards, there's only a few of them in the league, are generally not willing to give them up, but that's someone that they need. And they have to explore whether it's a true point guard or whether it's a guard that can go out there and score. They have to have some sort of Chris Paul insurance. And I think we've seen a Campaign is not that guy. Next up now for Utah, the question for me is, at what point do they pack this in? Like, when do you truly begin the tank? Because I think it's going to happen. They had a nice start to the year. They're still got a pretty decent record, but at some point you're going to start resting these veterans. You're going to start trading away some of these guys. You're going to start telling Lauri Markkanen, okay, you take the night off this night. Jordan Clarkson, you take the night off this night. Colin Sexton, you take the night off this night. It's going to happen. The question is just, when do they start that? Do they wait all the way until February to start tanking and do like Portland did last year, Indiana did last year, where you're losing like 17 of your last 20 games? Or do you start it right now to increase your odds? Teams like San Antonio have already started. San Antonio has already gone on that pace of losing like 17 of 20. And it's going to be interesting to see when teams like Utah, Oklahoma City, teams that we expect to tank, really start to put their name into that ring as well. Next up now, the New York Knicks. There's so many questions here, and I want to do a full-length video on like how to fix the Knicks, which I feel like I do every single year. But the question is like, what can we get? What can we get for someone like Julius Randle? Can we get rid of the coach and find somebody else that we like? What's the move in terms of who's the next star? There's like 18 questions right now about New York. I think Jalen Brunson's been good for them. I think he's been mostly worth the contract. It's been a weird RJ Barrett season. It's been a weird Julius Randle season. Tom Thibodeau has, I think, lost the favor of most of the players and the fan base, and it's just, there's a lot of questions around the Knicks right now. Next up now is Cleveland, and for me, it's certainly like, go get a wing. Like, it's not even a question. It's not a, do we need a wing? What's the piece we need to add? How can we become true top tier contenders? Go get a wing. You need someone that can guard and shoot. Go look around the league, find someone that has a little bit of size and can shoot the basketball and guard for you. Because no disrespect to guys like Isaac Okoro, Jetty Osman, Dean Wade, like, they're throwing guys out there that have a decent chance of doing what they need them for in the postseason. But once it gets to the playoffs, no disrespect to Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland, those guys are going to try and guard. They don't have a wing defender. Like, who, I know that they want Evan Mobley to maybe be that guy as an on-ball defender and then Jared Allen on the rim. But like, if they play Boston or they play Milwaukee, who's guarding Giannis? Who's guarding Jason Tatum? If you want to say that's Evan Mobley, that's fine. What happens when Evan Mobley gets 2 fouls in the first 3 minutes of the game guarding those guys, or he sets 1 illegal screen and then gets a cheap foul and he's got 2-3 fouls? You don't have another option. You don't have anybody else to guard those guys, and it's going to be a significant issue. As great as you are offensively with the 2 guards and as great as your rim defense can be with those 2 bigs, you need a wing. Go out and get one. Next up now is the Kings, and for me, it's just like, how aggressive do you really want to be in trying to end this playoff drought? It's very clear that Sacramento wants to make the playoffs. They don't just want to play in game. Like, they want a full playoff series. They want home playoff games. How aggressive do you want to be in going out to do that? Because you have picks you can trade. You can go out and add more to this roster. I think they have a pretty deep roster, a roster that works well together. But if they want another guard that can score, if they want a wing that can guard, if they want a little bit more depth at the 5 spot, how aggressive do they want to be in really going out and doing something that teams don't typically do, and that is push for a back-end play-in spot? How aggressive are they going to be in doing that? Next up now is Houston. This is a question for a lot of teams here, and that is just like, who do we want to keep, right? I mean, obviously Jalen Green, Jabari Smith, I think Şengün's good, Tari Eason, like, they have some guys in this roster that are interesting. And moving forward, you pick a handful of those guys, you continue to draft at the top of the draft, and you figure out who your core is, because you've got a ton of young players that you've brought in over the years, and you have to figure out who the foundational pieces are. There's foundational pieces, those guys that I mentioned, and then there's other pieces that if a team calls or you want to move them, you want to get some future assets, you're willing to trade those guys. Figure out your core pieces and then get a top draft pick and hope at some point it turns around for you. Next up now is the Denver Nuggets, and the questions for me certainly are, can you get Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. play well together and to be healthy? And if you can, you're contenders. Like, that's it. Again, it's all about health. It's going to be difficult for Jamal Murray to continue to figure it out coming off the ACL tear. Michael Porter Jr. has continually dealt with injury issues throughout his entire career, but if those guys are healthy and they are at their peak by the time you get to, March, and you can really start to go on a roll, maybe get a top 3 seed in the West and you go into the postseason fully ready to go, they have a team that can win a title. They absolutely have one of the best players in the league, Nikola Jokic, who arguably should be in contention for another MVP this season. It's unlikely they'll actually let him win it because people just get tired of voting for the same guys all the time. But if they can be healthy, they're a contender 100%. Next up now, Orlando. It's same thing as Houston pretty much. Like, find your foundational guys. Like, Paolo's incredible. Franz is really good. I really like Wendell Carter Jr. You've got a ton of guards. You've got a ton of wings. You've got guys coming back from injury like Jonathan Isaac. Figure out your core pieces. Get another top pick. It's a very similar thing as Houston. Next up now, Memphis. I feel like this is a question we've asked for years. When is the time to go all in? Or are you an all-in team? Are you just a team that continually builds, develops players? Or are you interested in trading away a couple of your wing? Maybe you're interested in trading away Zaire Williams once Jaren Jackson comes back and is fully healthy. The thing for them is, like, it's so hard to evaluate their team because they're never fully healthy. You never fully understand how good they actually are. Feels like they're just going to sit and wait and continue to develop these assets. But it is a question worth asking if the opportunity, comes up to bring in someone like Bradley Beal or one of these other stars around the league. Next up now, Charlotte. How can we keep LaMelo happy? How can we add pieces? How can we make sure that we're getting a top draft pick? We need someone else as a running mate alongside LaMelo, and that's pretty much all that matters. Next up, Detroit. It's pretty obviously time to tank. Cade's dealing with injury issues. The rest of the roster's not getting that good. Just continue to develop the young guys and continue to figure out, how you can best get really good draft lottery odds. Next up now, Indiana. Do you consider trading away guys like Buddy Hield, Miles Turner, maybe even Chris Duarte? It's very clear that Mathurin and Halliburton are the foundational pieces moving forward for this team. And even though you have a decent record, is it worth keeping some of those veterans or some of those trade pieces rather than continuing to add to a talent base that I think is really strong between those 2 young guards? That's a question for them, certainly. Second to last now, San Antonio. There's really no questions for them. They're bad. They're trying to be bad. And the question is just, can they get the first pick? Like, that's really where they're at. And then last up for the Clippers, it's obvious. It's health. How can we get healthy? How can we get Kawhi ready to go? Because if he's not ready to go, if he's not going to be Kawhi, they can't be contenders. And this entire, I would say, experiment, but really, era between Kawhi and Paul George both being in LA, it'll be a failure if they've just never really push and be true contenders. I know they made the conference finals once, but without Kawhi, they're not going to be able to win a title. And health is obviously the biggest question mark for them. And that's the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see y'all next time.